Ellen DeGeneres was an unstoppable force who made daytime TV a place of joy. She was a brave pioneer whose laughter became a lifeline for millions. The bright soul behind the Ellen DeGeneres Show and the unforgettable voice of Dory was a giant of courage and charm who changed what was possible in American culture. She carried the weight of breaking down barriers. Her talent, contributions, and bravery were all clear. The more praise she got, the more criticism she got, and the more she rose. The worse the wounds got. She became one of the few artists who was both loved as an icon and hurt by the harsh criticism of a world that wasn't ready to accept her truth yet. And if the storms of the past almost killed her, the storm around her at 67 is darker and more unrelenting, like a shadow that won't let go. We will find out what is still hidden behind the smile that once won America over, and what still echoes in the last chapter of a journey that was both great and sad. Whether you admire or question her, if she ever left a mark in your memory, leave a like as a way to honor a journey both radiant and storm-torn. Some homes are warm and welcoming, while others are cold and quiet. Ellen DeGeneres didn't find peace in that silence. It was heartbreaking, cruel, and a wound that bled in silence. Ellen was born on January 26, 1958, in Metairie, Louisiana, into a modest middle-class family. Her father, Elliot, worked in insurance, and her mother, Betty, stayed at home. Ellen was the youngest of two children. Her older brother, Vance, would also go on to work in entertainment. But in 1973, when her parents divorced, the normal comfort of family fell apart. She was only 15 at the time and saw the world around her fall apart. The family split apart, Vance staying with their father, while Ellen followed her mother into a new marriage and a new house in Atlanta, Texas, instead of safety. Those walls hid secrets and shadows that pressed against her young heart until she could hardly breathe. Ellen went through a betrayal as a teenager that would change her life forever. Her stepfather crossed lines that should never be crossed with a child, breaking her trust in the person who should have protected her. It was a terrible experience that no child should have to go through. It was cruel, it was heartbreaking, and it left scars she would carry for decades. The agony was compounded by timing. Her mother, Betty, was in the fight of her life battling breast cancer, her body frail, her spirit weighed down by illness. Unable to imagine that her own husband could be the source of her daughter's pain, Ellen, desperate and broken, turned to her mother for belief, for protection, for one voice to stand with her. But her words were met with disbelief, not because her mother did not love her, but because the truth was too unbearable, too unthinkable for a woman already drowning in her own suffering. That disbelief cut deeper than the betrayal itself, leaving Ellen with the unbearable weight of isolation and leaving Betty with the guilt that would haunt her for years, a tragedy of two souls, mother and daughter, both crushed by pain, both scarred by the shadows of one man's cruelty. Years later, Ellen would confess that the pain carved itself into her very soul. She admitted that learning to dance through life while crying inside was the hardest act she ever performed. The irony was bitter and tragic. The world would one day celebrate her as a beacon of laughter. Yet her first lessons in survival were not born from joy, but from silence, fear, and broken trust. The loneliness of her adolescence became unbearable. A cage built of family photographs that showed smiles while chaos reigned behind them. Ellen knew too soon that not every picture told the truth, and those hidden wounds became shadows she carried into adulthood, shadows that haunted her even as she stepped toward the spotlight. And yet, in the ashes of that heartbreak, something unexpected began to grow. Humor, sharp, quick, self-deprecating, emerged not as a pastime, but as a shield, her only weapon against the darkness that tried to consume her. Laughter became her survival, her defiance, her rebellion against cruelty. On nights when tears threatened to drown her spirit, Ellen sharpened her wit like armor, transforming betrayal into rhythm, silence into stories, wounds into punchlines that would one day make the world double over in laughter. This was not joy born of privilege, but of necessity. Her comedy was never just entertainment. It was escape, resilience, and a refusal to let cruelty define her. The wounds of her childhood shaped her, scarred her, and nearly silenced her forever. But Ellen DeGeneres refused to stay silent. From the ashes of broken trust, she built a voice that the world would one day celebrate, even though it had almost been lost to the tragic shadows of her youth. And from that pain, a stage was waiting, a destiny where laughter would become not just survival, but her calling to the world. The girl who once carried shadows in silence stepped into adulthood with nothing more than a battered spirit and a stubborn will to survive. In 1976, Ellen DeGeneres walked away from the University of New Orleans after only one semester, carrying no diploma in her hands but a storm in her heart. Determined to find a path of her own, she returned to New Orleans, a city that pulsed with music and laughter. Yet for her it was a battlefield of survival, rent overdue, cupboards echoing empty, dignity slipping through her fingers. Ellen took whatever job she could find because hunger and unpaid bills were as real as the air she breathed. She typed endlessly as a secretary in a law office until her fingers ached, folded endless piles of clothes at JCPenney until her back stiffened, painted murals with paint-stained hands that would not wash clean, carried heavy trays through smoky diners as a waitress, poured drinks late into the night behind a bar where laughter belonged to others but never to her. Every paycheck was a fragile lifeline, every shift a battlefield that drained her body but steeled her soul. Every hour worked a reminder that dreams are not given, they are bled for. But poverty did not just test her, it forged her. She learned to stretch a few crumpled dollars across a week, to ration bread like treasure, to swallow hunger while saving coins for bus fare, to smile at strangers across counters while her stomach twisted in emptiness. Even in those bone-weary days of endless labor, when her back throbbed from carrying trays and her pockets jingled with nothing but loose change, a voice inside her whispered that she was meant for something greater. She carried a battered notebook stained with coffee and sweat, filled with scribbled jokes, fragments of absurdity, sketches of pain disguised as humor, seeds of a future no one else could see. At night, in a cramped rented room with peeling walls and a flickering lamp that buzzed like a tired insect, she would rehearse alone, her shadow cast against the wall like a second silent audience. Sometimes she performed to a cracked mirror, sometimes to her pet, the only witness to a young woman turning heartbreak into laughter, hunger into punchlines, loneliness into rhythm. Those were nights of heartbreaking solitude, when dinner was nothing more than half a sandwich saved from work, when the applause existed only in her imagination and the silence of the room pressed heavier than the day's labor. Yet she sharpened her humor like a blade, slicing through despair with timing and wit, certain that one day the world would have no choice but to listen. Each line she scribbled, each joke she practiced was not just comedy. It was survival, resilience, defiance. She was teaching her self-discipline, timing, courage, and endurance, all forged in the furnace of struggle, all born from nights where the world forgot her, but she refused to forget herself. By the early 1980s, Ellen began stepping onto the dimly lit stages of New Orleans, smoky clubs and rundown bars, where laughter was scarce. Audiences were impatient and failure was often paid in silence. She was not polished, not yet confident, but her style was different, quick, intelligent, self-deprecating. She turned scars into punchlines, doubts into comedy, loneliness into rhythm. Sometimes the room was half empty, sometimes no one laughed, and she would walk home with tips barely enough for rent, clutching coins that jingled like cruel reminders of her struggle. But she refused to stop because every joke was rebellion, every laugh a victory against the silence that once tried to crush her. Her breakthrough did not come through luck, but through persistence that caught the eye of scouts, searching for fresh talent. In New Orleans, she was whispered about as the funniest person nobody knew, her name spreading like a secret carried from club to club until it reached the ears of those who booked the holy grail of comedy, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. And then, in 1986, destiny called. For a young comedian, there was no higher honor, no greater test. This was the stage where legends were made, and only Carson himself had the power to decide who was worthy. Ellen walked onto that stage with trembling hands and a pounding heart, but inside she carried the scars of her youth, the resilience of her hungry years, and the wit she had sharpened alone in a room of shadows. Her set was sharp, effortless, disarming, and the moment of truth came when Johnny Carson himself, with that knowing smile, beckoned her to join him on the couch, inviting her into the sacred space reserved only for the rarest talents. In that instant, Carson became the gatekeeper of her destiny, the man who validated not just her jokes, but her very existence as a voice that America could no longer ignore. That night was not just a performance, it was redemption written in laughter. It was a girl who had once been silenced, proving that her voice could command a nation. The applause was not just for the jokes, but for the journey. The waitress balancing trays in smoky diners, the painter with paint-stained hands, the lonely young woman rehearsing to a cracked mirror, now standing under the brightest lights with America listening. From that night forward, Ellen DeGeneres was no longer just a survivor. She was a rising star carrying with her the unshakable truth that even the deepest wounds can become the sharpest tools of creation. By the mid-1990s, Ellen DeGeneres had climbed from the back rooms of smoky clubs to the glittering promise of primetime television, and every step was earned through years of grinding persistence. She had been the guest who stole scenes on late-night stages, the comic whose sharp timing turned silence into laughter, and brick by brick she built the credibility that finally won her the impossible. A sitcom of her own, simply titled Ellen, it was more than a show. It was a coronation, the story of a girl who once scribbled jokes in a battered notebook now commanding the laughter of a nation. For a moment it seemed as though destiny had finally rewarded her long struggle, but fate had a more ruthless test waiting. In 1997 came the puppy episode, the moment that would etch her name into cultural history. On screen, Ellen's character said the words that mirrored the secret she had carried for years. She was gay. And off screen, Ellen herself chose to step into the same truth. It was groundbreaking. It was courageous. It was the raw honesty of a woman tired of hiding. But it was also terrifying. Behind the applause, Ellen knew the risk. To speak her truth was to gamble her career, her reputation, perhaps everything she had fought so hard to build. The moment was electric, but the fallout was merciless. Advertisers vanished, sponsors fled, conservative voices sharpened their knives, and ratings fell like a stone. Headlines that once celebrated her turned cruel, mocking and vindictive. In 1998, Ellen was canceled, not because it lacked talent or humor, but because the world was not yet ready for a woman brave enough to live openly. It was incredibly expensive. Ellen went from being one of America's biggest stars to a pariah overnight, rejected by Hollywood and left to fend for herself in the wilderness of her own truth. It was devastating. It was cruel. The silence that had plagued her early years reappeared, this time heightened by a society that opted to punish instead of celebrate. Nevertheless, the seed of a larger legacy was planted amid that destruction, because Ellen's downfall was not a result of failure, but rather the sacrifice required of pioneers and the cost of authenticity in a society still bound by discrimination. However, Ellen was not the type of woman to remain buried in silence. She had already made it through too much. She refused to give up, even though rejection had broken many before her. She rebuilt her life one painful step at a time, doing voiceover work, performing on small stages, and doing everything she could to show the world that she still had something to offer. She battled her way back to the stage that would change everything, the Ellen DeGeneres Show. In 2003, like a phoenix rising from ashes, what started out as a risk taken by networks unsure of her popularity turned into a phenomenon. Ellen's trademark was dancing, kindness, and laughter. As she turned daytime television into a cathedral of joy, she dominated daytime for almost 20 years, winning numerous daytime Emmy Awards and establishing a place where millions of people could find inspiration, solace, and escape. Her voice reverberated well beyond her studio's boundaries. Her portrayal of Dory in Pixar's Finding Nemo in 2003 was so well-liked that she returned to the role in Finding Dory over 10 years later. She established herself as a reliable host for the most glitzy entertainment events, directing the Emmys, Grammys, and Academy Awards with effortless wit and charm. Her journey also came full circle in 2016, when President Barack Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, for her talent, courage, influence, and unwavering spirit. The irony was astounding. She had almost been destroyed by honesty in 1997, but by 2016, that same honesty had turned her into a national treasure. Her legacy a lighthouse for millions who felt invisible, unheard, and unaccepted was built on the truth that once cost her everything. After enduring the storm of rejection, Ellen became one of America's most adored characters, a living example of how perseverance can turn adversity into success. Her journey from cancellation to celebration, from silence to presidential honor was not merely the trajectory of a career. Rather, it was the trajectory of a life that dared to be true to herself at all costs. With each laugh and tear she shed, Ellen DeGeneres made a lasting impression on a country that finally learned to embrace her honesty. For Ellen DeGeneres, the storm that would alter everything started with a tweet. But storms frequently start with whispers. Comedian Kevin D. Porter shared a seemingly humorous message on March 20, 2020. As the world sat in lockdown, yearning for solace and connection, right now, we all need a little kindness, as Ellen DeGeneres frequently discusses. She is also infamously one of the cruelest people on the planet. If you reply with your tales, I'll make a donation to the LA Food Bank. During quarantine, the internet was restless and hungry for stories, so it exploded. Hundreds and then thousands of people responded, including baristas, waitresses, viewers, and even former cast members. The smiling person, who had built an empire on kindness, was depicted in story after story, in a way that was startling. Some remembered being warned not to look Ellen in the eye. Others spoke of distance, coldness, and even punishment for small transgressions. It didn't matter if all the stories were true anymore. What mattered was the crack that showed up in her picture. The accusation against the woman who had concluded each episode with the words, "Be kind to one another," was more profound than any one rumor. A ripple turned into a tidal wave. The old clips came back. Interviews that had previously been written off as awkward comedy were now played back as proof of something darker. Taylor Swift blinking away tears, Mariah Carey caught off guard, and Dakota Johnson gently pushing back. Once laughing fans now winced, viewing the scene with new eyes. The internet, which had previously been her playground, became her jury as the phrase replaced Ellen gained popularity on various platforms. Then the tipping point arrived. BuzzFeed News released an investigation on July 16, 2020, which turned the rumors into news stories. 10 former workers described a toxic work environment that included rules that made employees feel invisible, intimidation, and fear. Even longtime fans of the show were shaken by the most shocking accusations made against 3 senior producers. Warner Media declared an internal investigation within a few days. Although the executives were quickly removed, Ellen's kingdom of kindness had already suffered harm. Ellen took aim at the controversy when the new season debuted that September. She said the words that used to have so much power as she stood under the bright lights. "I accept responsibility for what occurs at my show. The Ellen DeGeneres show is this. Ellen DeGeneres is who I am." She expressed regret and acknowledged that the workplace behind her smiling brand had failed to uphold the principles she had long advocated. The words sounded hollow to some, softened by awkward jokes that didn't belong. For others, it was a moment of humility. Although it was acknowledged, the apology did not make things better. Too much damage had already been done. More than 1 million ratings dropped. In a matter of months, sponsors withdrew, and the public trust that had once been her most valuable asset was depleted more quickly than it could be replenished. While devoted voices like Katy Perry and Kevin Hart supported her, others like Brad Garrett and Lee Thompson attested to the veracity of the stories. America's most joyous haven of laughter was now enshrouded in a shadow from which it was unable to emerge. Ellen declared that season 19 would be her final one in May 2021. She clarified that the show was no longer difficult after almost 20 years, but the timing was more important than her words. The announcement seemed more like a surrender to those who had witnessed her transition. From late-night performances to daytime royalty, a woman compelled to leave the stage that had once served as her haven. The guest from her first show, Jennifer Aniston, made a comeback to complete the circle when the last episode aired in May 2022. Instead of being a victory lap, it felt more like a somber farewell. The studio erupted in cheers. Words of appreciation and tears were exchanged, as though everyone in the room knew that this ending was not written by triumph, but by storm. There was still tension and silence beneath the celebration. Ellen grinned, her laughter tinged with fatigue, but the brightness that had once characterized her appeared to have faded. That stage had been her heartbeat, her haven, and her second home for almost 20 years. Not because she wanted to, but because she was unable to outrun the shadow that had fallen over it. She was now bidding it farewell. Thus, an era came to an end in the fog of contradiction rather than the flame of victory she had once imagined. The Ellen DeGeneres show transformed daytime television, brought happiness to millions, and ingrained kindness into society. However, in its last chapter, it served as a reminder of how brittle legacies really are, how doubt can undo decades of work, how the gap between image and reality can turn praise into doubt. It was a heartbreak that went far beyond headlines or ratings for Ellen. It was witnessing the very trust she had established fall apart before her very eyes. Brick by brick, joke by joke, and kindness by kindness. The stage that had once crowned her was now a mirror reflecting her darkest shadow, as well as her brightest light. It's devastating. It is humble. Above all, though, it is human. Ellen's fall did not negate the good she had done, nor did it justify the suffering they allegedly went through. It brought to light a reality that is all too frequently overlooked. Nobody, not even those hailed as superhuman, is capable of carrying perfection. And maybe the cruelest irony of all was that the words she had said at the conclusion of each show, "Be kind to one another," had become both her greatest gift and her greatest burden. This was the deepest wound she had yet to experience after overcoming cultural backlash, professional exile, and childhood shadows. How about love? Love was never kind to Ellen. Honesty was measured in wounds on the battlefield. She walked onto the volcano red carpet in 1997 while holding actress Hedges' hand, right before she revealed her truth to the world in the now famous puppy episode. To women standing together without apologizing and smiling was all it took to ignite America. It was more than romance. It was rebellion. It was bravery woven into the delicate tapestry of love. However, the cost was brutal. Hollywood flinched, its doors shutting one by one. Ellen, who was already struggling with the fallout from coming out, saw her career slip away from her contracts disappearing, sponsors pulling back, the phone that used to ring with offers now ringing silently. For Anne, the consequences were just as harsh: a family that couldn't accept her truth, tabloids that were like vultures, and a business that characterized their love as scandal rather than human. Beneath the glossy pictures of two women grinning valiantly, there was a tempest of rejection, fear, and tiredness. Under the harsh scrutiny of an unprepared world, what ought to have been a celebration of authenticity turned into a crucifixion. Their love, which blazed brightly until 2000, was gradually smothered by the weight of a society that penalized them for having the audacity to be openly themselves. Neither woman was hurt when it was over. With the familiar scar of being punished for speaking the truth, Ellen retreated into silence once more. The road, however, became darker for Anne. Her struggles with mental health were exposed by the media's harsh scrutiny. As she staggered through years of upheaval, what ought to have been private conflicts turned into a public spectacle, with each slip-up being magnified and each fracture examined. The tragedy that permanently silenced her then struck in 2022, at the age of 53, and lost her life in a severe and fatal car accident. It was a harsh conclusion to a life that had already seen more upheavals than most people could handle. Her passing made headlines for many. It served as a somber reminder to those who recalled her love for Ellen of how brittle and expensive authenticity had been during that time. What started out as a love that dared to shine turned into a story filled with wounds and ended in a silence that no one could ever overcome. In retrospect, their love was sacrifice rather than failure. Because it was a love that was ahead of its time, it was subject to the cruelty of the day. To allow others to love more freely in the future, they paid with their reputation, their career, and their peace of mind. The harshest reality, perhaps, is that what cost them almost everything would serve as the cornerstone for the liberties that others now enjoy. Their story was about more than just a woman in love. It was also about the wounds that honesty left behind and the unrelenting weight of a society that was not prepared for it. Ellen's heart yearned for stability after Anne, for a love that didn't feel like it was on the front lines of a cultural conflict. She became friends with actress and photographer Alexandra Hedison in 2001. Alexandra was a serene, introspective artist who seemed to have a softer perspective on the world and who used her camera to capture snippets of life. Along with her, Ellen found a more peaceful chapter following the storm. A house full of lengthy talks, creative exchanges, and seemingly everyday moments rather than news reports and scrutiny. Ordinary was a miracle in and of itself to a woman who had survived fire. Their 3-year relationship was characterized by love and a quest for normalcy. They established routines, enjoyed little pleasures, and worked to create a personal haven away from the bustle of Hollywood. But beneath the silence, fissures appeared. Ellen was still recovering from the wounds of her highly publicized love affair with Anne, and she was still troubled by the burden of rebuilding her career while being watched closely. Even though Alexandra was steady, she frequently found herself in love with a woman whose spirit was restless, torn between a desire for something more, something that could inspire and heal, and a thankfulness for the quiet. The strains of their despair lives Alexandra being drawn to a more private artistic life, while Ellen remaining in the spotlight slowly increased the gap between them. What had started out as a haven began to feel more like a stopgap, a port of call rather than a permanent residence. By 2004, they had quietly split up, not out of scandal or resentment, but rather with the quiet sadness of two people who loved each other very much but were unable to reconcile their needs and their contributions. In retrospect, Alexandra stood for change the gap that must be filled between grief and recovery. The hurdle Ellen had to get past before entering the forever love that was waiting for her. Alexandra was the calm that allowed her to breathe and remember that love could be tender, even if it wasn't permanent, whereas it had been the fire that tried her bravery, even though their paths diverged. That chapter was still crucial because it helped Ellen recognize and accept Portia de Rossi, the love that would soon help her weather the biggest storms of her life. Ellen DeGeneres was 46 years old in 2004 and had been through storms that would have broken many. She had endured both public and private wounds, passed through Alexandra Hedison's precarious haven, and lost a love that burned her brightly in a hedge. She was tired, bruised, and nearly certain that she would never be able to have permanence. She met Portia de Rossi, who was 31 at the time, in the midst of her exhaustion. Their encounter not only changed her life, but it also saved it. The stylish Australian actress Portia, who starred in Arrested Development and Ally McBeal, wore her own hidden scars. Beneath the fame and beauty, she struggled with depression, eating disorders, and the crippling burden of concealing who she really was in a cruelly critical industry. She had learned, like Ellen, to break in silently while smiling for the cameras. It was more than just attraction when their eyes locked. It was recognition. The women, both beaten by expectations, saw in one another a mirror that understood but did not pass judgment. After that, an extraordinary event occurred. Ellen's laughter came from joy instead of defense for the first time in years, and Portia found a love that saw her as a soul rather than a picture. The simple miracle of waking up next to someone who made the world feel safe. Long walks where conversation flowed into silence more consoling than applause, and quiet breakfasts shared in sunny kitchens were all examples of their days together, being more than just companionship, but also healing. Ellen once remarked, "Portia made me feel more loved than I ever imagined possible." Portia, on the other hand, called Ellen her soulmate and the rock that kept her calm during her storms. They bonded instantly but purposefully, driven by a strong desire for the truth rather than impulsive behavior. They made the decision to refuse to apologize and walk hand in hand into the light in 2005. Their love was an act of rebellion in a Hollywood still bound by whispers. It was risky, even dangerous, but it was honest, and the only thing either of them had left to offer was honesty. The world started to change slowly, with hands that had already held each other through storms. They took advantage of the brief opening of California's marriage equality laws in 2008 by holding a private ceremony at their Beverly Hills home. The rooms were filled with warmth rather than glitz, with family members hugging, friends wiping away tears, and laughter blending with the sound of vows uttered in shaky voices. Ellen, who was 50 years old at the time, was glowing with amazement that a promise she had previously believed was finally coming to pass. After years of being banished from herself, Portia, 35, stepped into a safe harbor with a calmness that she had long been denied. They had more than just words in their vows. They were declarations, wounds that were healed into hope, and scars that were healed into promises. Ellen vowed to stand as resolutely in silence as she would in cheers, to love and to defend. In addition to staying, Portia promised to recover and reveal herself completely, fearlessly and without disguise. There were more than two women getting married when they kissed to seal their vows. It was a victory forged out of decades of discrimination, bending history. Their home was filled with happiness that evening, with flowers strewn all over the tables, soft music playing, and friends raising a glass to a love that had remained unbreakable. Ellen later described the day as the first time she felt fully whole, and Portia said she felt like the luckiest woman alive, as living examples of how authenticity, despite its cost, can also be liberating, and that love can occasionally be both a private and a public revolution. They were no longer fugitives of love, but its pioneers. However, love is never without its challenges, even if it is predetermined. The 2008 vows did not alleviate Ellen's burdensome demands from fame, nor did they erase Portia's personal struggles with mental health and self-image. There were evenings when the hospital hallways were their only common area, when hushed assurances took the place of laughter, and when uncertainty threatened to reappear like an old foe. But unlike the previous loves, Ellen didn't withdraw into quiet or seclusion. She remained. She made the decision to choose love both in the shadow of fear and in the light of applause. The steady, unwavering presence that held Ellen's hand when the world's roar became too loud was Portia, who in turn became her anchor. When Ellen's legacy faltered under the weight of controversy, and the internet glared at her ruthlessly in 2020, that loyalty was put to the ultimate test. Millions who once applauded are now questioning, sponsors have fled, and headlines have been ridiculed. Portia, however, did not recoil. Her quiet strength was louder than any storm, and she stood her ground both in public and in private. She posted for words that became a lifeline in a moment that broke through the chaos. "I stand by Ellen." It was more than just a statement. It was a reaffirmed vow, evidence that the ties of love remained strong even as the world's trust crumbled. "Portia has made me feel more loved than I ever thought possible," Ellen later admitted when referring to Portia as her soulmate. Ellen and Portia are still inseparable nearly 20 years after they first met. Their homes, which range from Montecito to Beverly Hills and now include a retreat in the English countryside, are havens teeming with gardens, animals, and artwork, each of which serves as a canvas for the life they created together. They have exchanged headlines for the sound of trees rustling and red carpets for peaceful mornings. Ellen, who used to practice jokes by herself in a broken mirror, now wakes up next to the woman who made her feel better, once starving herself due to expectations. Portia now flourishes with a partner who values her as a person and not just an image. Despite its flaws, their love endures. It has withstood criticism, disease, time, and the ebb and flow of celebrity. It has transformed fear into family, silence into solidarity, and suffering into collaboration. If Alexandra was the bridge that helped Ellen get over her heartbreak, and it was the fire that tried her resolve, then Portia is the harbor, the last stable light that allowed a restless soul to find peace. The biggest victory for Ellen, after decades of outrunning storms and chasing laughter, was never a show, an award, or even a legacy. It was love, the kind that endures when the cheers stop, that stays when the cameras stop, and that mends wounds that the outside world cannot see. She not only found a mate in Portia de Rossi, but she also discovered the indisputable evidence that even the most broken lives can be restored. There is more to their story than just survival. It's about perseverance, redemption, and the rarest miracle of all, finding a place in someone else's heart. There are storms that develop gradually under the guise of time passing, and there are storms that break suddenly. The storms were no longer news stories or scandals for Ellen DeGeneres, who is now in her late 60s and approaching 70. Her body was gradually turning against her. She first talked about it publicly in 2023 when she was 65 years old, revealing what she had long kept to herself: osteoporosis, a condition that weakens bones to the point where a simple slip could result in a fracture; arthritis, which swells and stiffens her joints, making mornings a struggle before the day even started; and the twin mental burdens of obsessive-compulsive disorder (OCD), which pulls her in different directions and makes even the most basic tasks exhausting. She admitted, "I always assumed I was just restless, but now I realize my body can't always keep up with my brain, which never stops running." It was an uncommon instance of openness without the gimmick of humor, where sincerity was more important than jokes. And it didn't stop there. Ellen disclosed that the effects of aging had worsened as she grew closer to 70. Sharp flare-ups of arthritis in her hands and knees, persistent back pain from osteoporosis pressing on her spine, and fatigue that persisted regardless of how much she slept. These weren't fleeting aches and pains. They were constant companions, daily reminders that the body, no matter how praised, ages. The betrayal of her own bones and joints was the cruelest irony for a woman who was once defined by her energy, dancing, running across stages, and filling rooms with laughter. It was not a dramatic pain. It was ingrained in every day, unrelenting and uncompromising. Mornings were no longer easy. Instead, she had to stop at the edge of the bed and take slow breaths before she dared to get out of bed, because her joints were so stiff. Hands that used to move fluidly, adding flair to punchlines, now shuddered under the pressure of lifting a cup or opening a jar. Her knees and hips protested sharply at even the most basic walks, serving as reminders that her body was no longer the limitless powerhouse it once was. Nights had their own penalties, sleep broken by sharp pains, incessantly running thoughts, and the apprehensive fear of a mind that would not stop. This was the most difficult storm yet for a woman who had once been energized by movement and love for her seemingly limitless energy. The words of any critic were not as harsh as this betrayal by her own flesh. Yes, she had been scarred by scandal and fame, but age had humbled her in ways that no other thing could, forcing her to face her vulnerability head-on. Ellen did not, however, crumble under it. She made the decision to adjust and face decline head-on. Therapy was now a lifeline rather than an option. She openly talked about rearranging her days to fit softer rhythms, measured walks rather than running, slow stretches instead of dancing, meditation to stop her mind's restless cycles, and the guts to turn down the demands that used to define her career. Therapy is a mirror I can finally look into without making a joke, she said. Her public persona was stripped away by this admission, exposing not the entertainer, but the human being who was finally learning to be kind to herself. During it all, Portia evolved from a partner to Ellen's protector. She redesigned their home into a haven of comfort and healing, matched her steps to Ellen's slowing pace, and offered her arm when joints threatened to give way. Garden paths were designed to encourage gentle movement, meals were prepared to nourish frail bones, and softer chairs took the place of stiff ones. Ellen grinned in interviews with a genuine and humorous smile, saying, "Portia forces me to move when I don't want to and eat when I don't want to. She does it with love, too." That was the truth, not just a joke. Years of care, perseverance, and partnership took the place of what could have been years of decline. In these quiet conflicts, Portia's loyalty, which had been evident in 2020 when Ellen's reputation was damaged, grew even stronger. Her presence spoke louder than any grandiose declarations. She sat quietly next to Ellen during therapy, held her hand during checkups, and reminded her in 100 little ways that love could endure scandal, time, and even the body's betrayal. Their decision to move to England was not an escape. Rather, it was a decision to trade in the thunderous applause for the sound of birdsong and the glare of red carpets for the peace and quiet of garden paths. Every step they took together was now about progress, survival, and unity rather than performance. "I used to think success was being everywhere," Ellen admitted in 2024, her voice softer but more steady than before. "Success now consists of simply getting out of bed, stretching, taking a walk with Portia, and expressing gratitude." Her greatest wisdom was contained in that silent redefinition. It is devastating to watch her slow down and witness a body that was once so active falter. She now addresses anyone who has experienced the gradual betrayal of aging, and who has gazed in the mirror and seen frailty staring back. So there is inspiration in that heartbreak. Her tale is not one of failure, but of perseverance, the grace required to persevere, and the most precious gift of all, a partner whose love transforms weakness into strength. Therefore, Ellen's later years are characterized by testimony rather than scandal or even humor. The body will deteriorate, the mind will wander, and storms will always arrive. But even the harshest realities of aging can be endured with integrity, compassion, and the unwavering support of love. The last act for the woman who once made the world laugh is no longer about laughter. Rather, it is about graceful survival and demonstrating that the purest form of victory is kindness, when it is directed inward and shared with the one who remains. Ellen DeGeneres refused to disappear in silence, even though she had learned to live with slower steps by 2024. Even though her body was no longer designed for constant movement, she decided to use her voice one final time because it still had power. She made a comeback to the stage that year with a Netflix special titled For Your Approval, and a farewell stand-up tour called Ellen's Last Stand-Up. She said at the opening, "Yes, I will talk about it." Additionally, audiences leaned in for truth rather than just jokes for the first time in years. Part comedy, part confession, and part farewell ensued, tales of the brutality of celebrity, observations on growing older, acknowledgments of her shortcomings, and bursts of the razor-sharp wit that once made her unstoppable. As though everyone in the room realized that this was not just entertainment, but the final chapter of a woman closing her own book. There was a hint of melancholy in the laughter. Ellen refrained from chasing another spotlight when the curtain finally came down. Rather, she and Portia retreated from the spotlight of Hollywood and opted for the peaceful embrace of the English countryside, their Cotswolds home, encircled by undulating hills, narrow lanes, and stone cottages that date back hundreds of years, had transformed into a haven far from red carpets by 2025. When Ellen was getting close to 70, there, mornings came with mist curling over fields and birdsong drifting through open windows. Rather than studio applause, every day was paced by the sound of gardening, the turning of pages in Portia's art books, and the presence of cherished animals that roamed freely throughout their property. Ellen never gave up her old love of houses, even though she retired from show business. She keeps purchasing and renovating homes with Portia, turning them into life-filled, minimalistic retreats before selling them. The once frantic game of flipping multi-million-dollar properties in Montecito and Beverly Hills has slowed down to a more delicate endeavor that is more about creating beauty than making money. The size of her empire is still astounding, though. She has purchased and sold over 20 opulent homes over the years, and her estimated net worth is currently $450 million, which is enormous wealth by any standard. Ironically, though, no amount of wealth can calm the pain in her bones, the stiffness in her joints, or the restless raging in her head. She appears to live in an almost idyllic setting, with blooming gardens, rooms brimming with art, and Portia always close by. Ellen, however, is aware of the price of her journey. In more subdued moments, she acknowledges that her sharpest jokes occasionally concealed her sharpest wounds, and that fame brought her both loneliness and laughter, like shadows on a bright wall. The controversies that once threatened to destroy her legacy continue to linger. Additionally, as she ages, she is forced to confront regrets that she cannot change, such as the relationship she lost, the trust that was betrayed, and the years when ambition overshadowed kindness. But love has persevered in the face of fragility. She finds that therapy helps her deal with the constant pull of OCD and ADHD. When Portia's arthritis requires her to be still, gentle walks help her stay active, and her strongest stronghold is now the marriage she once believed was impossible. Nothing compares to the peaceful evenings when Ellen and Portia sit together in their garden. The world diminished to two voices, to hands and to hearts that have withstood storms. Ellen's wealth includes art collections, expansive estates, and millions in the bank. It is a life that is both admirable and humble, with great wealth weighed against the indisputable reality of death, and public success overshadowed by personal regret. Ellen DeGeneres views England as a place of reckoning rather than escape, where she can finally take a break, relax, and realize that her legacy is not based on wealth or celebrity, but rather on having the guts to continue living a life of integrity even after the spotlight has faded. There is no greater contrast. Her quick wit, flawless timing, and fearless originality turned comedy from smoky club stages to living rooms across the country. She was the same woman who once stood at the center of American pop culture. She transformed daytime television into a cathedral of dancing, laughter, and giving for 19 seasons, transforming viewers into friends in her orbit rather than just viewers. Few people could match her combination of incisive intelligence and effortless charm, which allowed her to dominate the biggest stages in the world while hosting the Oscars, Grammys, and Emmys. Her voice became a global icon of innocence and hope, as she gave life to Dory, Pixar's iconic Blue Tang. In addition to her humor, she was recognized for her cultural influence and her unique capacity to change people's perceptions, broaden their perspectives, and redefine what it meant to be a woman who dared to be herself when she was granted the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016. However, this was also the woman who faced terrible criticism, including the fall of her sitcom following her 1997 come-out and the 2020 storm that called into question the very kindness upon which she had based her business. The legacy of Ellen DeGeneres is not perfect or untarnished. Her brilliance, which shone not because life was easy, but rather because she refused to let the shadows extinguish her light, may be what makes her talent and her victories even more remarkable, despite her imperfections. To judge her life based on perfection would be to overlook the reality of her situation. Her greatness came from repeatedly daring to live in the open, even at excruciating costs, rather than from being perfect. She taught the world in 1997 that while authenticity can be punished, it can also permanently change culture. She demonstrated during her talk show years that visibility, generosity, and laughter could reach millions of homes and ease the pain of loneliness. Even the most admired people make mistakes. Kindness must be lived rather than just spoken. And legacies are not carved in marble, but are stitched from both victories and regrets. These realities were revealed by her later struggles. A pristine portrait is not a legacy. Near her retirement, a critic wrote, "It's a canvas of starts and restarts, failures and grace." Perhaps the best way to honor Ellen is to acknowledge the bravery of someone who continued to walk through the shadows in her story, rather than to ignore or excuse them. The reminder that storms will come, bodies will falter, and reputations will bend, but honesty, resiliency, and love can still carry us home. Is something more timeless for those who once found solace in her laughter. If her voice ever filled the quiet of a lonely afternoon, whether you admired her or not, please leave a note of gratitude below and tell us what aspect of her journey most resonates with you? The storms, the laughter, the tenacity, or the way she kept returning to the stage?